This is key to topic 23, Radicals Extra 17, and this is the worksheet. So notice that in these problems, the denominator has two terms. So it's no longer just one term, it's two terms. And you have a square root. And so we're dealing with square roots in all these cases. And so remember, to rationalize the denominator means you don't want a square root in the denominator. Because notice, for one thing, the square root of 6 is an irrational number, and then the number 3 minus square root of 6 is also irrational because of the square root of 6. All right, so let's go ahead and think about how to do number 1. So remember, you want to rationalize to the denominator. All right, so number 1, you have 5 divided by 3 minus the square root of 6. All right, so to get rid of that square root that's in the denominator, to make this denominator a rational number, because right now this denominator is irrational, to make it a rational number, since we have two terms, remember, you're going to use the conjugate. So use the conjugate. And so the conjugate of 3 minus the square root of 6 is 3 plus the square root of 6. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this over. So you're going to have 5 divided by, 5 divided by 3 minus the square root of 6. So you multiply both numerator and denominator by the conjugate. Because remember, what you do to the denominator, you have to do to the numerator to make this still 1. Make this 1, and 1 times this is still this. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite this. Then I'm going to write this as one fraction now. So I'm going to say 5 times this. Again, make sure you put that in parentheses, because all of these terms have to be multiplied by 5 at some point. But before you do that, multiply this out and see if you can reduce anything before distributing. See if you can reduce before distributing. Okay, so now I'm going to multiply these two factors here, these two denominators, which have two terms, and those are conjugates. One of the things you learned is that when you use the FOIL method on here, the out and the inner cancel out. They add up to be 0. Just keep that in mind. All right, so let's go up to the side and kind of do that work. So I'm going to rewrite this here. So we have 3 minus the square root of 6 times 3 plus the square root of 6. And so multiplying that out, we have 3 times 3 is 9. The outer is 3 square root of 6. The inner, a negative square root of 6 times 3 is a negative 3 square root of 6. And hence the idea that they add to be 0, because a positive 3 square root of 6 and a negative 3 square root of 6 is 0. And then the last, a negative times a positive is a negative, and then the square root of 6 times the square root of 6 is just 6. The square root of 36, which is 6. And so we have 9 minus 6, which is 3. So that's the denominator. Now be careful, don't think you can reduce these 3's here, because even though this is a factor in the denominator, this 3 is not a factor in the numerator. This 3 is part of this factor here, okay? So be careful. Now all you're going to do now is just go ahead and distribute. So I get 15 plus 5 square root of 6 divided by 3. And so that's your answer. All right. Number 2, we have the square root of 6 divided by the square root of 3 plus 4. So again, I have an irrational number. My denominator is irrational. In particular, you notice you have the square root of 3. All right. And so we need to get rid of that square root. Since my denominator has two terms, the way to do that is to use the conjugate. So the conjugate of the square root of 3 plus 4 will be the square root of 3 minus 4. So multiply both numerator and denominator by that conjugate. All right, square root of 3 minus 4. And so now I'm going to go rewrite as one fraction, just like I did this. So this becomes the square root of 6 times the square root of 3 minus 4 divided by, and then let's go ahead and multiply this out. So when I multiply that out, I get the square root of 3 plus 4 times the square root of 3 minus 4. And so the square root of 3 times square root of 3 is 3. The outer, the square root of 3 times a negative 4 is negative 4 square root of 3. The inner, a positive 4 square root of 3 times positive 4 times square root of 3 is a positive 4 square root of 3. And notice, those have to be 0. Negative 4 square root of 3 and a positive 4 square root of 3 is 0. And then the last, a positive 4 times a negative 4 is a negative 16. And so 3 minus 16 is a negative 13. Okay, so that's the denominator. Now notice I can't reduce this and this, because that's the square root of 6, and even if it wasn't square root of 6, I still couldn't reduce it. And so now you're just going to multiply. You're going to distribute. Now when you distribute, notice you get the square root of 6 times the square root of 3 is the square root of 18. And then minus the square root of 6 times 4 is 4 square root of 6, all divided by negative 13. Now you have to simplify the square root of 18. You've got to go further. If you stop there, you're not going to get all your points. You'll get most of them because you did quite a bit of work here. And and so when you simplify the square root of 18, remember you get the square root of 9 times the square root of 2, so that's 3 square root of 2. So that's this. So you get 3 square root of 2 minus 4 square root of 6 divided by negative 13. And so there's your answer. Now what some students will do, by the way, just to let you know, is they just know that some textbooks may not have negative 13. They may have 13 in the denominator. I just want you to I want to remind you how to do that. So let me just show you. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this over. And so you get 3 square root of 2 minus 4 square root of 6 divided by negative 13. So you can rewrite this negative 13 as this. So this becomes, and you can put the negative out in front. So it becomes negative, and then 3 square root of 2 minus 4 square root of 6 divided by 13. All right, so those two mean the same thing. The other thing you can do is distribute the negative through the numerator. So this becomes negative 3 square root of 2, and the opposite of a negative 4 is a positive 4 square root of 6 divided by 13. So either one of those are other ways of writing this, other ways you can see the answer written. So this was a multiple choice question. You could see this, you could see this, you could see this. Okay? So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to write this as 3 square root of 2 plus 4 square root of 6. So that's just another way of writing the answer. All right, so that's number 2. All right, let's look at number 3. So number 3, you have 3 divided by 6 plus the square root of 2x. All right. And so notice I have a variable here, but we can handle that. And so remember, I want to get rid of that square root. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply both numerator and denominator by the conjugate of 6 plus square root of 2x, which is 6 minus the square root of 2x, just like this. Okay? And so I'm going to write this now as one fraction. So I get 3 times 6 minus the square root of 2x divided by, now let's multiply this out. So I have 6 plus the square root of 2x times 6 minus the square root of 2x. And so when you use a fall, remember the outer and the inner, always make sure the outer and the inner cancel out because those are conjugates. So 6 times 6 is 36. The outer, a positive times a negative is a negative, so I get negative 6 square root of 2x. The inner is a positive 6 square root of 2x, and notice those are like terms. You have a negative 6 square root of 2x and a positive 6 square root of 2x, that's 0. And then a positive times a negative is a negative, and remember the square root of 2x times the square root of 2x is just 2x, right? Because that's the square root of 4x squared, which becomes 2x. The square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of x squared is x. So that's minus 2x. So this becomes 36 minus 2x. So that's your numerator. And you cannot reduce this and this. So don't see, that's an x right here, 2x. Don't think you can reduce the 3 and the 36 because 36 is not a factor in the denominator. It's part of this. Okay, so this whole thing's a factor. So what you would do next is just go ahead and distribute. So I get, when you distribute, I get 18 minus 3 square root of 2x divided by 36 minus 2x. And that's it. That's all you can do. All right, now again, don't say you can reduce the 18 into 36 because 18 is not a factor. 36 is not a factor. This whole thing is a factor of the numerator, and this whole thing is a factor of the denominator. Okay? All right, and then let's look at number 4. I'm going to go ahead and do number 4 here. So number 4, we have the square root of 5 divided by the square root of 2 minus the square root of 5. So this time, notice you have 2 square roots, so that may be a little bit more challenging for you, but we'll see. The process is the same. You're going to multiply both numerator and denominator by the conjugate. And so the conjugate of the square root of 2 minus the square root of 5 is the square root of 2 plus the square root of 5, just like this. And then we're going to write as one fraction. So this becomes the square root of 5 times the square root of 2 plus the square root of 5 divided by, and then let's multiply this out. So I have the square root of 2 minus the square root of 5 times the square root of 2 plus the square root of 5, right? So when I FOIL, the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is 2. The outer is the square root of, okay, look what you have. You have the outer is the square root of 2 times the square root of 5, which you know is the square root of 10, right? So I get plus the square root of 10. The inner, same idea, except will be negative, square root of 10. So minus square root of 10. And then a positive 1 square root of 10 and negative 1 square root of 10 is 0. And then a negative times a positive, you look at the last now, a negative times a positive is a negative. The square root of 5 times square root of 5 is 5. Oops, sorry, right here, 5, right? All right, and so now I get 2 minus 5, which is a negative 3. So this becomes a negative 3 right here. Okay, now go ahead and distribute the square root of 5. When you do that, I'm going to write it here. I'm going to get the, when I distribute the square root of 5 times the square root of 2 is the square root of 10. And then the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is 5 because it's the square root of 25. So I get square root of 10 divided plus 5 divided by negative 3. So there's one of the answers. And remember in the previous problem we talked about, well, what if you want to make that 3 positive in the denominator? That's that same discussion we had here. So if you wanted to do that, so I'm going to go ahead and write that here. So remember that discussion we had? So if I do this one, if you think about that one, you can write, you can put this negative out in front, just like this. Okay, so that's so you're saying the opposite of this fraction. That's 1, or you can distribute now. So you can put the negative through the numerator. So it becomes negative square root of 10 minus 5 divided by 3. Okay, just like that. So those are just other ways of writing the answer. All right, so that's number 4. So I'm going to go ahead and just do it so that you could say negative square root of 10 minus 5 divided by 3. So these two are the same thing. Kind of makes sense. Just make sure you understand this. It makes sense because remember, if I have this, just to remind you, if I have this, let's say I had 3, let's do 4 plus 8 divided by negative 2. So you all know that this right here is the same thing as saying a negative 4 minus 8 divided by 2. You're just changing the signs in the numerator. You're basically dividing by that negative 1. See, negative 1 times 2? So 4 divided by that negative 1 is a negative 4. 8 divided by that negative 1 is a negative 8. Because remember, this means the same thing as saying 4 plus 8 divided by negative 1 times 2. So you're just taking that negative 1, dividing it into the numerator, or dividing each term by. Okay? All right, and then, so that was number 4. So let's look at number 5. So number 5, we have 3 minus the square root of 7 divided by 2 plus the square root of 5. Now this is going to be a little bit more challenging because remember, in all our previous problems, the numerators only had one term. Okay? Now we have 2 terms in the numerator. So might be a little bit more work, but we'll see. So we're going to go ahead and multiply. So I got to get rid of that square root. So we're going to use a conjugate since we have 2 terms. So I have 3 minus the square root of 7 divided by 2 plus the square root of 5. And then the next step you're going to say, you're going to multiply both numerator and denominator by the conjugate of the denominator. Now notice this time you have 2 terms times 2 terms, and the denominator 2 terms times 2 terms. Okay, so let's talk about let's rewrite like this first. So this I can write as 3 minus the square root of 7 times 2 minus the square root of 5 divided by, and then 2 plus the square root of 5 times 2 minus the square root of 5, right? Okay, and then let's go ahead and multiply this out. So let's do the numerator first, and we'll go ahead and rewrite it down here. So 3 minus the square root of 7 times 2 minus the square root of 5. So let's FOIL this. 3 times 2 is 6. The outer 3 times a negative square root of 5 is a negative 3 square root of 5. The inner, a negative square root of 7 times 2 is a negative 2 square root of 7. And then the last, a negative times a negative is a positive. The square root of 7 times the square root of 5 is the square root of 35. Okay? And notice none of these are like terms. None of those are like terms, and I cannot simplify any of them any further. So my numerator is going to have 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 terms. That's what your numerator will have. 6 minus 3 square root of 5 minus 2 square root of 7 plus the square root of 35. Okay? So that's your numerator. Can't do anything else to this. Can't combine any like terms. None of those terms are alike. This is square root of 5, this is square root of 7. This is square root of 35. Those are all different. Now let's multiply the denominator. 2 plus the square root of 5 times 2 minus the square root of 5. So first, we get 4. Outer, we get minus 2 square root of 5. Now remember, those are conjugates, so the outer and the inner will be opposites. Square root of 5 times 2 is 2 square root of 5. So since they're opposites, a negative 2 square root of 5 and a positive 2 square root of 5 is 0 when you add them up. And then the last, a positive times a negative is a negative, and the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is 5. So you get 4 minus 5, which is negative 1. So that is your denominator. Okay. Now, technically, this could be an answer, but we prefer, if that's a 1 or a negative 1 down here, we just prefer to go ahead and just divide all these terms by that. So 6 divided by negative 1 is a negative 6. So this becomes negative 6. Negative 3 square root of 5 divided by negative 1 is a positive 3 square root of 5. A negative 2 square root of 7 divided by negative 1 is a positive 2 square root of 7. And then square root of 35 divided by negative 1 is a negative square root of 35. So that's the answer you would see. Is probably this one because that happened. This turned out to be a negative 1. All right. But if you left it as negative 1, I'll give you full credit for it. Okay. So that is the key to. Let's see. All right. So that's the key to topic 23, worksheet extra 17.